Perhaps the biggest problem with the DCEU, and one that fans of the universe like to totally ignore, is the fact that executives at Warner Bros. Would amass creative teams and pour money into films and television shows that went absolutely nowhere. This is another massive reason they ultimately pulled the plug on the universe and decided that a reboot was necessary. Also, without a clear vision or visionary in charge more than a few years at a time throughout the universe's life, it was nearly impossible to course correct and save a lot of these projects, as a lot of them no longer fit with the plan after a few months, let alone a few years, with the constant status quo changes. Frankly, it was a miracle a lot of the films we got survived the 3+ year production schedule. I have to speculate the creatives in Hollywood probably had a hard time jumping onto projects by the end, with the massive amount of films and shows that just never came to be. With well over 30 films and television shows that were officially announced and never seen the light of day, many of which already had plans in place and creatives attached, meaning only about a third of the projects that were revealed to fans ever made it to the screen. These figures, on top of the controversy surrounding Batgirl being scrapped, made DC a terrible omen, especially in the last year of its life, on top of generally poor critical reception and dwindling box office hauls. We will get into the reboot soon. For now, I want to talk a little about each of the canceled films we know about and what those disastrous productions looked like. Batgirl was originally supposed to appear in the film that would go on to become Birds of Prey, and then in Ben Affleck's Batman, before being phased out of those films in later drafts in favor of a solo story, which was set to be written and directed by one of the many controversial creatives in the DCEU, Joss Whedon, in 2017 with the help of another alleged abuser, Jeff Johns. A real winning pair that worked out so well on the Justice League film. Production was set to start in 2018, but he ultimately left the project to February of that year. The next plan was to hire a female director to take the project over and bring the female perspective, but ultimately they decided to go against that idea in favor of hiring two dudes, the ones who directed Bad Boys for Life specifically. They also downgraded it from a theatrical to an HBO release around this time. The film ended up making it into production, with the film having a pretty exciting cast, including Leslie Grace as Batgirl, J.K. Simmons as Commissioner Gordon, Brendan Fraser as Firefly, and Michael Keaton as Batman. After filming on the project completed, Warner flirted with the idea of increasing the budget to give a more comprehensive post-production run and release it to theaters, kind of like what they did with Blue Beetle, but ultimately took a 180 and decided to cancel the project outright and use it as a tax write-off in the 2022 season. This was for several reasons. For one, the studio wanted to focus on large cinematic experiences where Batgirl's made-for-TV nature just didn't quite make the cut. On top of that, executives claimed the film didn't really work from a story standpoint, and the final nail in the coffin, and perhaps the most damning thing for Batgirl, was the financials. The streaming model was proving difficult to turn a quick buck on films, and with the film not fit for theaters according to test audiences and studio executives, it made the most financial sense, supposedly, to write off the film and leave it to rot in the Warner vaults. I personally think it'll be illegally released one day, at least a work print or something. Things like this have a way of leaking out, as we could see with things like Roger Corman's Fantastic Four film, another film claimed destroyed that eventually showed up in its entirety that seemed in a mostly finished state. I imagine, and I am hopeful for a work print or something at some point. Will the movie be good? Probably not, but I hope for the sake of the artists involved we get to see it in some form one day. Another infamous canceled film was Ben Affleck's solo run as Batman. As you know from this video, Batman was introduced older and more hardened than most other movie Batmans in Batman v Superman, and while that was a baffling choice in my opinion, they also had big plans to give Ben Affleck his own Batman film, which would have hopefully ironed out Affleck's character more. It was intended to be directed by Ben Affleck after he finished work on his 2016 film Live by Night, with Jeff Johns co-writing the film, because despite being the most overrated writer in the history of comics, they wanted his input. The first draft was finished in March 2016. The film set Batman up against Deathstroke and primarily took place in Arkham Asylum, with Batgirl set to appear, as we said previously. And it was supposed to show Robin's death, which was hinted on during BVS, being more fleshed out in the film, probably adding to be the emotional core of the film or something. The film started to unravel largely on the back of Ben Affleck, who at first stepped down from the role of director as he didn't feel he had the passion someone else could bring to the film as a director, with eventually Matt Reeves, known for his Planet of the Apes reimagining, taking the reign from Affleck as the director. The original plan was for Ben Affleck to star, but Warner Bros. And Matt Reeves felt while Affleck's version had potential, he wanted to go in a different direction, and executives at Warner Bros. Wanted something outside of the box rather than a straight cinematic universe version that would have to play by established rules. Thus, Ben Affleck's Batman became Matt Reeves and Robert Pattinson's Batman. I think we ultimately got a better product with Matt Reeves' Batman, but he delivered my type of Batman film, whereas I think a lot of people may have preferred Ben Affleck's, and I still think Ben Affleck's film would have been interesting as kind of like a superhero Die Hard is what I'm picturing. However, I guess we'll never know. A project based on the DC character Bane was in the writing and pitch phase by future Blue Beetle director Angel Manuel Soto. It would have followed the origins of the character. We don't know how this would have changed the origin or if it was going to take a more comic accurate approach than what we saw in Batman and Robin, as well as The Dark Knight Rises. This could have been cool, however the issue is by the time this was in the pitching phase, Ben Affleck was kind of already only loosely attached to the character, so it's unclear how this would have been connected to the wider DCEU, or if this would have been kind of like those disastrous Sony movies where it's just solo villains and not the hero they're supposed to be connected to. I suspect we'll see Bane in the DCU somehow, as he is a major villain, and I suspect Matt Reeves may also introduce him in some form during his series of Batman films, given the fact that Pattinson's Batman uses Venom in the film, which is directly tied to Bane and his origin, so I don't think Bane fans will be waiting long to see him back on the big screen. In December 2022, right before James Gunn took the reins and started crafting his DC reboot, a Batman Beyond film was announced. This would be the first take of Terry McGinnis' Batman brought to live action, and what would have been an attempt to bring the character back to relevance after 21 years of his show being off the air. While Terry had some comics in the coming years, being that his character was in a different era of the DCU, he never really had time to shine on the page in my opinion. He couldn't really be set in the standard constantly changing DC continuity, so he had to be Elseworlds, and that affected sales. So Terry McGinnis has kind of been in the dark for a long time. The film was set to follow the events of Flash, with Michael Keaton returning as Bruce Wayne. It was also set to include Catwoman, who I speculate was imagined to be the return of Michelle Pfeiffer in the role, but at this point it's only speculation, as something like that has never been confirmed. The project was helmed by Christina Hodson, who previously worked on Birds of Prey, The Flash, and the Transformers film Bumblebee. While it fell through, James Gunn has been on record saying he could potentially see something like that seeing the light of day as a multiverse film, all of the continuing adventures of Joker and Todd Phillips' Joker, and Batman and Matt Reeves' universes respectively, so this one might just lose attachment to the DCEU. While in deep research for this video, I found out they were trying to make an Aqualad action comedy drama for HBO Max, at least it was pitched. It would have featured Jackson Hyde's version of Aqualad, and although we don't officially know if it was supposed to be set in the DCEU, it is quite possible, as when it was announced in 2022, Warner Bros. Was trying to push a lot of DC releases on HBO Max. At one point, Zack Snider pitched a movie based on The Atom that would have starred Ryan Choi, who, as we discussed earlier, briefly appeared in the Snyder Cut. Not much is known about what the film would have been, but Zack Snider was said to be working on the concept and likely would have produced, with Zhang Kai starring as the titular shrinking hero. Could have been cool and might have been different from Snyder's other projects in the DCEU, but it never seemed to make it much further than the pitching stage of production, and of course the casting of Kai as the Atom, with his brief appearance in Zack Snyder's version of the Justice League film. Black Adam was Dwayne Johnson's failed attempt at launching a sub-franchise within the DCEU, and after the film failed to connect at the box office, or with fans, the plans for multiple sequels were scrapped. It seems the original plan was to have at least a trilogy and a potential Justice Society spin-off film, though we'll get back to that. This was of course dependent on the box office results and reception. Unfortunately, the film was not able to double its budget, and with marketing costs factored in, it most likely lost money. On top of that, when James Gunn took over as the creative head of the DCEU, it seemed The Rock's passion project was destined to remain a single film affair. From what we know of the film based on interviews and of course the now infamous end credits scene, the film was set to follow a conflict between Black Adam and Superman. I speculate it would have been titled something like Black Adam v Superman, Dawn of the Rock's Vanity or something like that. In 2021, a HBO spin-off of Journey Smollett's Black Canary was being developed, which would tie into her appearance as the character in the Birds of Prey film. We never learned anything about the plot of this film or how far along it got in development. However, the idea was likely to create this film in the same vein as the Batgirl film, where it would be a relatively small production when compared to the theatrically released entries in the franchise, and one can speculate that the character may have perhaps crossed over with Batgirl and likely other Birds of Prey members as time went on, but it never went anywhere. This project seemed to have silently disappeared. Blackhawks is a comic about an elite squadron of pilots led by the mysterious Black Hawk during World War II, in kind of a Charlie's Angels situation. Steven Spielberg was set to direct, and it potentially could have been in the DCEU, but it was unknown since it was intended to be a period piece. Spielberg was set to work on it after he finished work on The Fabelmans, West Side Story, and Indiana Jones 5, which of course he didn't end up directing. And it's not impossible that this film still ends up happening, but with the WB regime change and Spielberg's perpetually busy schedule, it's unknown if this will move forward anytime soon. I'm pretty sure if Spielberg ends up wanting to tell this story, it will happen. Whether that is a multiverse project, a DCU project, or what, is yet to be seen, however, but only time will tell if this is something we ever see in one form or another. In mid-2022, WB started frantically kicking around ideas to capture the multiverse trend popularized by films like Spider-Man No Way Home by attempting to recreate one of the most popular multiverse storylines of all time, Crisis on Infinite Earths, a comic series which seems utterly unadaptable to me for many reasons. For one, the sheer scale and amount of locations and characters featured in the comic story, and the cartoon that they just made a three-parter of was pretty disastrous. However, they were planning on doing this, but ultimately it fell through once Gunn and Safran's universe went into production. I imagine we would have seen a lot of actors and characters back, which may have been fun, but I think the DCEU never developed enough to make this story satisfying the way it should be. Ultimately, it seemed like a last-ditch effort to save a dying universe that went nowhere. Thankfully, if you really want to see this on screen, you can see the animated adaptation, which as I said was pretty disastrous, but you can. They did an Arrowverse version, which I will probably never watch, and I imagine if everything goes right with Gunn's universe, we may see this story on the big screen someday, and maybe someone will be able to crack it and figure out how to tell it outside of the comics medium. But only time will tell, I suppose. Cyborg was announced as part of DC's 2014 DC slate for the upcoming years, with a planned release date of 2020, which at the time was kind of a long way off. Ray Fisher, the controversial DCEU whistleblower who called out Joss Whedon, Jeff Johns, and others in his many rants against the company, was set to lead the film, with him fighting for Zack Snider to direct. Ultimately, the film went nowhere after its announcement and after Fisher's dispute with the studio. The film started to unravel as Fisher said he would not do it with the current studio heads. The studio responded saying they wouldn't recast, and ultimately the film was pretty much just silently cancelled over time. I suspect that we'll see Cyborg at some point in the new DC universe, as I kind of always say, but whether or not he gets his own film is kind of hard to say. I would kind of doubt it unless he's big in the future iteration of Justice League or Teen Titans or wherever they put him. But only time will tell, I guess. Deadshot was set to be a spin-off of David Ayer's Suicide Squad, starring one of the film's stars, Will Smith, as Deadshot. We don't know a ton about this film's plot, but by 2019 it was confirmed Will Smith left the job due to salary conflicts, lack of interest, and scheduling conflicts. Smith was seemingly written into early drafts of The Suicide Squad, but was ultimately replaced by the similar character Bloodsport, portrayed by Idris Elba, and I think after that, the project was 100% dead in the water. At one point, Joe Magnolia's Deathstroke was supposed to have a solo film, much like the plans for the character being in Batman and in Justice League. This ultimately fell through. Deathstroke was set to be written by Magnolio himself, with the Raid director Gareth Evans on to direct. Sounds like this could have been a fun action film based around Korean action films. Sadly, this didn't really go anywhere, and by 2021 it was revealed by Mandolios that the film was not a priority for the studio, so it was quietly cancelled. The Flash had a sequel in development that was contingent on the success of the first film. Not much is known about where this follow-up would have went. However, after The Flash flopped along with the new universe starting up, it seemed impractical to continue the series. We now know none of the main 6 Justice League members are returning. I also have to speculate that given the rocky production of the original film and all the Ezra Miller stuff, it may have been more trouble than it was worth to try to do a sequel. Green Lantern Corps was another unrealized project from the 2014 DCEU slate. After Green Lantern with Ryan Reynolds was a disaster, critically and commercially, plans to make spin-offs and sequels in that world were abruptly cancelled just months after the film hit theaters. Warner Bros. Had Green Lantern Corps on the map for a 2020 release, which probably would have given it enough time for people to wash their memories of the Ryan Reynolds disaster. However, much like Cyborg, it doesn't seem there was much beyond the concept phase and the announcement. We know Nathan Fillion will be playing Guy Gardner in the new DCU, and some sort of Green Lantern Corps show is coming out soon, which means we'll finally see the Green Lantern character in some form on screen for the first time in 12 years, though notably it'll be Guy Gardner's version, not Hal Jordan. And I know there was that one Green Lantern in fucking Zack Snider's Justice League, I don't care. Gotham City Sirens was basically a direct sequel to Suicide Squad in concept. Starring Margot Robbie as Harley Quinn, the film would see the introduction of Catwoman and Poison Ivy. Leto was also set to return as the Joker. Ultimately, Birds of Prey ended up coming out first, which was seemingly Robbie's decision as she wanted to explore lesser-known characters. However, she still had a passion for the project, and as recently as 2022, she's expressed interest in seeing the dynamic and relationship between Harley Quinn and Poison Ivy on screen. Though since she said that, it's been confirmed that Margot Robbie is stepping away from the DCU moving forward, so while we may still see this film in some form in the future, it won't be with the original cast planned when this movie was announced back in the day. Harley Quinn had another film in the works, with this film being tentatively titled Harley Quinn vs. Joker, which presumably would have seen the former lovers face off in some form. I imagine the idea may have been essentially merged into some themes we saw in Birds of Prey, as the film was cancelled in February of 2019, about a year before Birds of Prey ended up hitting theaters. I imagine the excitement for the then upcoming Joker film starring Joaquin Phoenix, as well as Jared Leto's poor reception as the characters, added to WB's reasoning behind canceling this film. Our Man was announced in March 2021. The character is an early DC hero created in 1940. Not a ton is known about this film, except that a couple filmmakers, Gavin James and Neil Widener, were attached to pitch this project. This is one of the projects that I am most upset got cancelled. Our Man was always kind of a cool character to me growing up, and there's a lot of potential with these Golden Age characters to take some creative liberties or to look at the character from a legacy perspective, kind of like they did with Blue Beetle and the Blue Beetle mantle in that film, where we saw Dan Garrett, Ted Kord, and Jaime Reyes's iterations all come to be important aspects of the story. This could have been a cool one. Alas, it didn't seem to get far in production, since there isn't a ton of information on this one, however. At one point, the DCEU was trying to produce a John Constantine show that would tie into a potential Justice League Dark franchise. The show was set to be produced by J.J. Abrams, who at one point was being eyeballed to reinvent the DCEU before being quietly phased out, though recently, his Batman the Caped Crusader show he's done with Bruce Timm has finally released, so some projects seem to have moved forward in some form, though this show got far enough into production that multiple episodes were written and they were looking for a new diverse cast for the show, However, Warner Bros. Decided to pivot out of the television show route and was at the time hoping to make a sequel to the cult hit Constantine movie, which did alright in theaters, despite not making a lot of waves at the time, and I speculate the temptation of getting a star like Keanu Reeves, who is adored by fans and arguably more popular than ever, was more enticing than trying to reinvent the Constantine concept to the small screen on HBO, though it's still up in the air if we're even going to get the Keanu Reeves version anymore. Another spin-off of Suicide Squad was attempted with Jared Leto's Joker. The film was set to be produced by Jared Leto and of course star Jared Leto as Joker. Little is known about the plot, but there was definitely a turbulent end to the production. The film was in production while Todd Phillips and Joaquin Phoenix's take on the Joker was also in development for some reason. The only issue was Jared Leto was still working on his version without knowing that there was another version being produced at the same studio. Between the rocky reception of Jared Leto's version and Warner liking what they were seeing with Phillips' version, they pulled the plug on Jared Leto's version. This would lead the actor to start a campaign to get the rival film cancelled. That would not be a successful campaign, with Phillips ultimately releasing his film to acclaim and a large box office pull. Jared Leto would cameo as the character one more time in Zack Snider's Justice League, but his film went nowhere. Well, Zack Snyder eventually got to make a loose trilogy with his version of Justice League, along with Batman v Superman and Man of Steel. The original vision, as announced in the 2014 DCEU slate announcement, was for Zack to do two Justice League films, dubbed at the time Part 1 and Part 2. Based on what we got in Justice League, it seems the first film would have covered the battle with Steppenwolf, with the sequel following the Justice League's battle against Darkseid. After Snyder left the first Justice League and was replaced by Joss Whedon, the plans seem to have changed, with Joss Whedon's cut teasing the Injustice League. Regardless, both versions of the potential Justice League sequel were cancelled. I think this film has to be one of the most blatant examples of WB counting their chickens before they hatch. It's also kind of hilarious that WB greenlit two separate versions of Justice League and couldn't get either off the ground, with the first Justice League being a disaster and the second one not even happening. Hopefully James Gunn has more luck with DC's premier superhero team down the line. I just hope they don't try to rush it and get too big for their bridges on it again. Another project that had a lot of potential but was horribly mishandled by the studio was Justice League Dark. In the comics, Justice League Dark is basically the supernatural version of the Justice League. The concept of the film started life as a script by Guillermo del Toro in 2013, though by 2015 he left the project to work on other things. Doug Liman took over the project. The project was then fully rehauled to be an HBO Max TV show when J.J. Abrams was working on a series of projects for DC, with the intention being that the show would work a lot like Marvel's Defenders show, with each character on the team's roster starting out on their own HBO show before teaming up in this Justice League Dark film or TV series. We don't know the team's exact roster, except it can be presumed that Constantine was part of it since he is a major player in the Justice League Dark comic line, and J.J. Abrams was developing both this as well as the Constantine TV show. This could have been an interesting series, but alas, nothing ever came of it. A JSA movie was teased as a spin-off to Black Adam, starring the early superhero team, the Justice Society. Not much is known about this film. We likely would have seen the return of the Justice Society members that showed up in Black Adam, but it's hard to say what the roster would have looked like beyond the couple of Justice Society members that survived that film, and possibly Pierce Brosnan, because they were playing with the idea of bringing him back at one point. See my Black Adam segment if you're curious. But I imagine there would also be some other unmentioned older members, and perhaps some further new recruits. Could have been an interesting film, but again, nothing yet on that one. Krypton was a project that was intended to be part of the DCEU when it was originally announced back in 2014, following events taking place on Krypton 200 years before Man of Steel. Ultimately, it was retooled into a standalone series that ran on the Sci-Fi Channel for 2 seasons. One producer described it as adjacent to the DCEU and the Arrowverse, which is a real fancy way of saying it's not canon to anything. Much like Batman, this is less of a cancellation and more of a retool for convenience project's sake. Lobo has had a long and turbulent journey on his way to the screen that has ultimately culminated in nothing so far. And yes, he has a couple of potential adaptations that were set to take place in the DCEU. Work on Lobo started before the DCEU and was conceived back in 2009, with Guy Ritchie set to direct before it was passed to Brad Payton. Black Adam himself, The Rock, was intended to star as Lobo before pivoting into the Black Adam role. In 2018, a script was put together by Jason Fowles with Michael Bay pinned as the director. This was the farthest Lobo would get into the DCEU proper. Recently, it's been reported that Lobo is being developed again, with Jason Momoa looking to star now that his tenure as Aquaman has come to an end. That's the rumor, at least. Lobo personally has never been a favorite of mine, but I hope one day someone can put something together for him so that fans of the character can be happy. He's kind of cool, I guess. He's alright. Madam X is one character that I'm surprised never went anywhere. Okay, I'm joking. I had 14 long boxes of DC Comics until I sold them all for drug money, and I had not heard of this lady once in my life. Sometimes these studios really scrape the bottom of the barrel, and Madam X is no exception. J.J. Abrams was attempting to develop this show as another spin-off of Justice League Dark, but as J.J.'s shows and films all fell apart, so too did Madam X. I don't really have any commentary on this cancellation, but I think this is how you oversaturate the genre, by putting out literally any shit people see on a comic book quarter bin. Like, who is Madam X? I think the story of a lot of these cancellations is that Warner Bros. Had no idea what they were doing and screwed over numerous creatives while they tried to create projects in the DC universe. I think no one was done as dirty as Henry Cavill, who was a team player since the day he helped start the DCEU with Zack Snider. Other than the mustache incident, his love for the character and universe was unwavering. That said, the history of Man of Steel 2 is baffling and kind of weird. Warner Bros. Initially confirmed in 2014 a Man of Steel 2 was happening, though this film would eventually become Batman v Superman. In 2017, Matthew Vaughn, known for his spy and superhero films, was tapped to direct, but this eventually fell through as the wheels kept spinning, with production not moving forward at Warner Bros., so Matthew Vaughn cut ties. Christopher McQuarrie of Mission Impossible fame also attempted to revive the project, but with WB dragging their feet like they did with Matthew Vaughn, he left again. Ironically, McQuarrie would work with Cavill around this time on Mission Impossible Fallout, and Vaughn worked with Cavill on Argyle, so at least Cavill seemed to have gotten work off of these attempts to make Man of Steel 2, or the two just seemed to want to work with the guy. I don't know. After all this, Michael B. Jordan pitched some ideas for the characters, but due to commitments with other franchises, this never went anywhere. J.J. Abrams took over the project, but much like the rest of J.J. Abrams' plans for DC, this went nowhere, and after Cavill's appearance in Black Adam, there was a final chance for the project to finally come to light, but ultimately James Gunn came along and had a different vision for what to do with the character, and Man of Steel 2 never came out, though we will be getting Superman 2025 next year, so that's kind of exciting, I guess. The Metal Men started production way back in 2007 before Barry Summerfield took over to helm the project in 2012. Not much is known on the project or its progress until it was confirmed in 2021 to being worked on again. Since James Gunn took over, it seems Metal Men is back on ice for however long. Perhaps it'll never get a movie. But the Metal Men are a pretty fun team, so I'm hoping to see a project based on them to come out in the future, as I think it would have potential to be fun and unique. New Gods was DC's take on Jack Kirby's characters from the New Gods comic line, which famously set up a lot of the lore for Darkseid. These characters were probably Kirby's most famous contribution to DC, with most of his famous contributions being from Marvel Comics, obviously. The series is comparable to the Eternals, which did end up getting a movie through Marvel. It was supposed to be directed by Ava Dunvey, with the project being developed from 2018 to 2021. Warner Bros. Has stated interest in returning to the lore of New Gods one day, but it's currently not being pushed by the company and is put on ice. The main reason it was cancelled is that Darkseid was essential to the story, and given the recent release of Zack Snider's Justice League, they didn't want to double dip on the villain. Chris McKay, who was pretty hot off the Lego Batman movie, was tapped to bring Nightwing, Batman's first Robin, to the big screen Bane in his first solo outing. Dick and the other Robins have been having a hard time finding a place on the screen after he was ignored by Keaton, Bale, and Affleck's portrayal. And while we had Schumacher's version with Batman Forever and Batman and Robin, it was high time we saw a new version of this character on the screen that was perhaps closer to the source material. Unfortunately, even with McKay's success on the Lego Batman movie making a fun Batman tie-in film, he didn't have enough pull to bring Nightwing to screen. McKay kept fighting for the film until it was officially considered dead in the water. Though we know Batman's returning to James Gunn's DC, so there's a solid chance that we may see an adaptation of Nightwing and hopefully a film or a TV show or something down the line. Black Manta was set to be a spin-off of Aquaman starring Black Manta. It was set to be a horror film to an extent, and Black Manta was set to face off against the Trench. It was going to be produced by James Wan, who outside of Aquaman was primarily a horror guy with films like Insidious, The Conjuring, and Saw under his belt. This film probably would have been pretty cool, and I like the idea that it was going to be done on a smaller budget with an emphasis on horror. Peter Safran was involved, and I think it'd be interesting to see if James Gunn and Peter Safran could get James Wan to come back and do some kind of horror concept in the DCEU one day. One can only hope. Regardless, it was cancelled in 2021 with WB expressing interest in possibly doing something similar in the future, but only time will tell. Towards the end of 2018, a Plastic Man action comedy film was announced based on the character Plastic Man, who is an early goofy comedy action superhero. It made sense to make a comedy action film based on the guy. However, the initial script by Amanda Idoko was not well received, so they had it rewritten by Kat Vasco, though ultimately nothing came of the project. Plastic Man seems right up James Gunn's alley, so this is another one I think we might see in the future in some form. Static Shock was a planned HBO Max exclusive film, which much like every other film planned for that format, ended up never seeing the light of day. Michael B. Jordan was set to produce after the film was announced, but ultimately, nothing ever really came together on the project. Static Shock is most well known for his DC animated show that lasted a few seasons in the early 2000s. I think they could do something with the character in the future, but we'll have to wait and see for now. Strange Tales was set to be a show based on DC characters that was an anthology of 1-hour stories that would be set behind the lens of DC Comics characters and would be made for HBO Max. It was written and created by Kevin Smith and Eric Carrasco and was cancelled in 2022. It likely would have been a multiverse series so as not to tie the entire series down to one continuity. One pitched episode was set to have Jimmy Olsen and Perry White in the Bizarro world. It brings to mind a fun Silver Age vibe, which actually sounded pretty cool. Perhaps a little Twilight Zone influenced as well. While it was never realized, it probably would have taken place over multiple continuities, and it sounded interesting, so I thought I'd mention it, despite it possibly not having anything to do with the DCEU. In the wake of Zack Snider's Justice League being seen as a general improvement over the theatrically released version helmed by Joss Whedon, fans were asking for a similar treatment for David Ayer's Suicide Squad, with the director himself saying he could make a better version of the film. That said, with Zack Snider's Justice League version not doing a ton for Warner Bros. Financially as an HBO Max release, it seemed they didn't want to give the same treatment to the widely panned Suicide Squad movie that seemed to have far less fans than even the Justice League version did. I almost think I would have been more interested in seeing this film, to be honest, than even Zack Snider's Justice League. Suicide Squad was clearly a much longer movie chopped into pieces by a trailer company. Many editors were fired and they just credited the guy who worked on the first edit, John Gilroy, but the wide rumor is that an uncredited final editor was actually a trailer house. Ultimately, it probably would have been nice to see the darker version with more comprehensive backstories and edited by an actual editor. Music licensing was probably very expensive theatrically, and licensing new music, the same songs, or having to rescore probably would have been a major expense. Also, when you have bigger actors like Will Smith and Margot Robbie, who despite Will Smith working with Ayer a couple times outside of the Suicide Squad, are incredibly busy and couldn't come back if they needed to be reshot for any scenes. It was kind of a miracle we got Snyder's Justice League, and I think that really only happened due to COVID freeing up schedules and a huge fan outcry. It wouldn't be totally unheard of in the future. You do have cuts like the Richard Donner cut, which came out years after Superman 2, but with a lack of fanfare, I don't really foresee this happening in the future, to be honest. In late 2019, a show based on Themyscira was announced by Patty Jenkins. It was set to be a spin-off of the DCEU's Wonder Woman property. While nothing ever came of this, it seems James Gunn retooled the idea for his upcoming Paradise Lost HBO series, which is said to be essentially the DCU's version of Game of Thrones, supposedly. It's kind of weird they're calling the show Paradise Lost, considering if you look up the show with HBO in the search, it's more likely to bring you the 1996 documentary about the child murders at Robin Hills, which was produced by HBO in the 90s. It's a good documentary, but it's a hard watch for obvious reasons. Anyways, moving on. In July 2021, the idea of Michael B. Jordan's Man of Steel was changed into a Val Zod HBO Max show. Val Zod is the Superman of New 52's Earth 2. Confusingly, you have to specify which Earth 2 when you're talking about DC. And it follows Val Zod taking over the role of Superman after Kal-El's death. He was a pretty interesting character, I suppose. It's unknown if this was considered to be a multiverse story, or if they intended to add this character to the DCEU, though regardless of the plans, the show was cancelled, and as of right now, we don't know much about what the plot was going to be. Warner Bros. At one point announced that a Wonder Twins film was intended to go direct to HBO Max, and like all other projects set to premiere on the streaming service, the project never saw the light of day. Based on the characters who first appeared in the Super Friends, the Wonder Twins seem like one of the most bizarre attempted additions to the DCEU. Adam Seakill was set to direct the film as his directorial debut. He did lend his talents to films like Black Adam and Scoob, so I suppose he has a foot in both Hanna-Barbera and DC properties, though it went nowhere, as the company wanted to refocus on theatrical releases, and Warner Brothers, rightfully so, saw the film as too niche for something that would have costed around $75 million before marketing. Patty Jenkins wrote Wonder Woman 3 while working on Wonder Woman 84. The film wouldn't see the light of day, however. After Wonder Woman 84 came out towards the start of the pandemic and wasn't received well, the film kept getting pushed back until James Gunn's plans were revealed and the plug was officially pulled on the third film. I think it was honestly dead after the reception of Wonder Woman 1984 though. No one had a ton of enthusiasm for Wonder Woman after that movie. It's also a pretty known issue that women have one chance in Hollywood, and Patty Jenkins lost a lot of opportunities since the failure of Wonder Woman 84. She lost her chance at Star Wars around this same time as well. Honestly though, if you want your work to actually see the light of day, I think DC and Star Wars are the last two franchises you want to be tied to, but whatever. Alright, finally we have Zatana. Consideration for Zatana started in 2018, but it was officially greenlit as an HBO Max exclusive in 2021 with J.J. Abrams on board to produce. Naturally, since both HBO Max and J.J. Abrams' plans went up in smoke, besides the Cape Crusader, Zatana did too, which is sad because Zatana's a really cool character and a Justice Leaguer who doesn't get nearly enough love on screen.